We'll just go ahead and start. Thanks everybody for being here for another PCC forum. I've been really excited to have Adam here. He was one of the first people I asked to be involved this semester, and I think it works well that he's coming after Laura 2 weeks ago in her project in Phenomenology, because I think Adam's is in line with that too. His dissertation work into philosophy as a spiritual practice and like sharing it online on everything he's been writing has been a really source of inspiration for me. So yeah, it's been worthwhile for me in that way. And then he'll also be introducing the Side View, which is this new podcast and essay series that will be open today. So yeah, I'll let him tell you more about that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashton. Thanks everybody for being here. As Ashton just mentioned, the Side View is a project I've been working on for over a year. I think I started harassing some of you about ideas and details and drafts and possible configurations maybe even a year and a half ago. I think the original plan was one sheet of paper, and it's grown into everything that I put online today. So I wanted to say a little bit about what is the Side View, and Ashton already mentioned that the Side View is a website. It's an essay series, it's a podcast series, it's a journal, and it's soon to be a publishing house. We're gonna put out books. We put out our first essays and podcasts today. We have 7 essays with 3 or 4 more coming over the weekend. Put up our first 3 podcasts, and we'll be recording those about once a week going forward. But beyond being just all of these kind of different media, the Side View is also really related to what I'm doing with my dissertation research here. And so what I wanted to talk to you guys today about was what's behind the philosophy of the Side View, what's informing the general vision, what's bringing all of these different people together. And part of why I wanted to put it together is just that I was working on various parts of my dissertation, or even just thinking about getting ready to work on different parts of my dissertation, and I thought that so much of the stuff that I was reading about and so much of the stuff that I'm interested in just has to do with doing things in community, doing things with groups of people, not doing it all by yourself. So I thought it'd be fun if maybe I could turn this into some kind of a vehicle or a module, the dissertation research, into something that other people could kind of plug their ideas into. As I kind of unfold the ideas behind the website, I think you'll see that there's a framework here, or an approach, or a set of practices, or maybe just a relation to what you're doing that can be applied to almost anything, I think. And so today I'm going to share with you, the first thing I'm going to share with you is just as part of the website, I have a little like 1-page description of what the project is. And you can actually go to the website and look at it, and there's a little audio component there. But I wanted to read that for you. It's just about a page long. And then just kind of unpack the different, I tried to write it in a way where you didn't have to be a grad student to understand it. You didn't have to be a philosopher to understand it. But I think if you are interested in those things, there's sort of levels, or there's depth there that you can open up. There's layers of insight that went into writing it. So I'm going to read for you this little description, and then I'm going to explain to you what I think it means. And I'll show you after I read it what all the pieces that are involved in this. So what is the Side View? The Side View is about the knowledge and intuition we use to navigate the world. It's about how our minds meet the world, but it's also about how our minds, when they're trained in the right way, change how we perceive what's around us and within us. It's about how we become skilled perceivers and doers, people who know the right details to attend to and the right actions to take. The idea is that we can develop new ways of making sense of things, ways that change what we're able to do in the world. From our perspective, sense-making is its own kind of craft, and the medium of this craft isn't paint or stone or wood, but your own perception. Perception on this view is a skill you can shape through practice. We see our ability to pay attention to things as an art of its own. It's an art of looking at things in a certain way. These are good taglines for the side view. Attention is an art form, perception is a skill. But when we dig deeper into what this approach really means, to what it makes possible for us in our lives, we find something more interesting. When we start to look at our own perception in this way, we find that we can actually take hold of some of these dynamics and change them. In a way, the whole process of learning is about creating these transformations in perception. The side view is about making sense of this process. By looking at perception and experience, we're making sense of how we make sense. We draw from philosophers, scientists, and athletes, as well as designers, artists, and contemplatives. What connects these approaches is the idea of practice, and the understanding that practice, in whatever discipline, is first and foremost about transforming perception and our ability to act in the world. Today, there's a tendency to focus only on the facts that experts produce, but we look at these people from a different angle. We study how they learn to see the world in new ways to begin with. Take the architect as an example. The architect sees with an eye for design that the rest of us do not have, with a capacity for understanding how we might shape the environment and how the environment might shape us. There's a level of understanding at work here that's unique to architects, but we can say the same of carpenters, meditators, or athletes. They all have heightened levels of perceptual ability and unique capacities for sense-making cultivated through practice, experience, and learning. The ancient Greeks used the word askesis, meaning exercise or training, to describe this process of transformation. We're using this concept to explore the training needed to create skillful experts in any field and to learn what the world looks like from their perspective. Our hope is that when we understand the nature of this process, new possibilities will open up for each of us in our own lives, possibilities that would otherwise remain hidden or inaccessible. So that's the basic spiel. If I was pitching this for money, that's what I would tell people. But there's a lot kind of baked into that little one-page essay that I think if you can get to the details of that process, you can get to much deeper levels and maybe more important levels of understanding things like the nature of the self, the nature of perception, the nature of acting skillfully, acting in the right way. There's a certain component of virtue that's involved here. So on one level, it's kind of a way of looking at how do people get good at what they do, which I think is interesting. But I think if you take it a level deeper, that same process involves a lot of change in the person. In other words, there's a lot of things that you have to do to yourself in order to get good at what you're trying to learn. And so I ended with this concept of askesis, and so I want to start with this idea of askesis and philosophy as a way of life that we get from Pierre Hadot. From there, as Ashton mentioned in his introduction, a lot of this is coming out of phenomenology, or at least there are analogs in phenomenological philosophy that help us explain some of these concepts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then there's this whole question of where do you train or where do you practice? And so in the third section, I want to take it out of this sense that that practice or training is something that you do as an individual by yourself, inside of yourself, and bring it out into the environments that might promote the kind of practices that are trying to get you to where you're going. And then I'll just close with a few comments on what we have on the website, how you can participate, how you can follow, share, etc., that kind of thing. So let's get into the philosophy here a little bit. A central idea behind the side view is this idea of askesis. And if you Google askesis right now, you'll find something like a definition that reads like severe self-discipline. So you think of like fasting or celibacy or withdrawing from the world entirely, these kinds of very extreme practices. But I'm using the term in a different way, in a little bit more of a general way, just to refer to any intentional practice that produces a transformation in the person. So askesis could be diet, it could be sleep, it could be meditation, it could be physical training, it could be study, it could be therapy, any of these things. Hadot, though, when he's talking about askesis, he says these are all good examples of training or practice, but the one that philosophers are really at root concerned with is this askesis of the self, of a self developing a relation to itself. And so in order to do that, you need to become aware that you are a self, and that that self didn't come from nowhere. It has an origin, and in some sense you're responsible for maintaining it, for creating it, for directing where it goes and how it develops. And so Hadot wants us to first recognize that this askesis of seeing a self in relationship to itself has to happen before any other philosophy can take place. And he's saying that when you do this, you start to realize that you can actually look, you can take a kind of a distance from yourself and look at what you're doing. You can look at your sensing. And so one of the ways you could define philosophy is that it's looking at sensing. And so there's this kind of move there where you're exercising an evaluation in your first person experience as it's happening. You're not just letting it happen. It's not just an unquestioned thing. This is the world is as I perceive it, right? You're taking another step there. And Hadot says that if you want to get good at this kind of thing and make it part of your regular life, then you should think of it like you think of physical training, like a kind of athletics. It's a kind of like contemplative athletics. And so he says this about philosophy, which for him is a kind of spiritual exercise, a spiritual exercise of the self learning to relate to itself. He says, underlying this conviction that people can modify, transform, and realize themselves is the parallelism between physical and spiritual exercises. Just as by dint of repeated physical exercises, athletes give new form and strength to their bodies, so the philosopher develops his strength of soul, modifies his inner climate, transforms his vision of the world, and finally his entire being. The analogy seems all the more self-evident in that the gymnasium, the place where physical exercises were practiced, was the same place where philosophy lessons were given. In other words, it was also the place for training in spiritual gymnastics. So you get this sense that for Hadot, philosophy isn't a kind of just an analytic or a discursive thing. It's something that kind of brings on the whole of your being, your whole life, every aspect of your life, your values, your perception, how you treat other people, how you engage in the world. And so he says that philosophy at root is an existential choice. The kind of philosophy that you inhabit or that you profess or that you think to be true isn't just a set of truth claims that you can kind of hold over here while you're living this way. No, philosophy for Hadot is a choice of life, but it's also a way of making a life. You're making yourself through these philosophical practices. So in that sense, philosophy is a kind of self-making that comes out of practice. So practice is really before the sense of self or who you take yourself to be. It's not, this is one of the essays we published today written by Sam Mickey, who you all know. He said, and I think captures this point really well, your body isn't something you do with your practice. Wait, what did he say? I'm going to get it right. Your practice isn't something you do with your body. Your body is something you do with your practice. In other words, your body, your sense of self, your sense of identity isn't a starting point, it's an outcome. It's an outcome of your habits and your choices. So whatever else we might say about theory and practice, Hadot argues, philosophy is first and foremost this question of self-transformation. And within this idea of self-transformation, he also has a particular image of knowledge that I think is very important for the side view. And this image is one that sees knowledge as deeply implicated in your sort of ground level perception and action in the world. So there's not sort of one layer of perception down here where you're just receiving sort of sense data, and then another level where you're kind of bringing your knowledge to bear on it. He's saying knowledge is actually this thing, if it is actually knowledge, that's become a part of you. It's become a part of how you see things. So knowledge is only knowledge insofar as it changes how you act and perceive. And so there's a scholar, Edward McGushan, who I think captures this idea really well, and I'm going to read a quote from him. He says, "One does not merely collect knowledge and store it away. Rather, one makes knowledge, discourse, or logos active as one's very mode of perception of the world, of others, and of oneself. It becomes one corporeal relation to things. The body itself becomes a philosophical corpus, a philosophical oeuvre." So in this way, logos becomes a part of the person's perception and capacity to act. The logos must become part of the physical structure of the individual and part of their tacit knowing and doing. So before they have to think about things, the world has already shown up for them in a certain way because of the knowledge and experience they already have. So knowledge is actually this kind of reorganization of your body. It's a reorganization of your sensory system. It's teaching you how to look and see in a different way. And so Hadot picks up on this concept of the habitus, which is like your general bodily constitution. And he connects this to Henri Bergson, another French philosopher, and picks up this definition of philosophy, that philosophy really is a transformation in perception. So what is philosophy? It's a set of skills or practices for transforming perception, maybe transforming perception on purpose. And Hadot's clear that with this definition in mind, it doesn't matter sort of what the empirical sciences reveal, what neuroscience says about how the brain functions and how the nervous system functions. It's not about that. Those details are going to change. The science is going to change. We're going to get better or worse at understanding those things. But this idea that whatever that physical system is, what philosophy is doing is acting on it. So philosophy is this practice of transformation. It's a kind of a way of achieving a conversion in perception is one way you could think about it, or a kind of a metamorphosis in your own ability to see in the world. So Hadot's understanding of philosophy really fed into this aspect of the side view, which is that this is true of philosophy, but it's also true of really any other discipline. So you can talk about architecture in that way. You can talk about meditation in that way. You're talking about sort of inner sense instead of just external outer sense. But the fact that you're training perception to get into this more nuanced space is kind of the same. So there's like a general understanding of how practice acts on the person that doesn't really have anything to do with the specific skill or discipline that you're talking about. So switching gears a little bit, the other group of philosophers that have historically been interested in these kinds of questions are phenomenologists. I'm particularly interested in a group of phenomenologists who are bridging the gap between phenomenology and empirical science, so people like Evan Thompson and Francisco Varela. Sometimes what they do is called neurophenomenology, which is this kind of circulation between what the neurosciences say is empirically the case about human bodies and other organisms, circulated against how we experience the world in our first-person experience and what structures that first-person experience. So for phenomenologists, they have this kind of, or phenomenologists and enactivists will say, the other term they use to describe themselves as enactivists. And enactivism isn't just an approach to human phenomenology, but it's an approach to, it's a theory of life, really. So what the enactivists are saying applies to human beings just as well as it does to bacteria and bats and any other kind of critter that you could imagine. And so the basic concept that enactivists use in understanding living beings is this idea of sense-making. And sense-making is just this idea that whatever kind of organism that you are, you show up and make a world of perception that's relevant and significant to you. And so this idea that there's just raw sensory data or raw sensory perception on one hand, and then the values or knowledges or biases or whatever other, kind of like linguistic barriers you want to add to that are like two separate things, kind of falls apart. And so I'll give you a few definitions of sense-making. Evan Thompson gives you a couple. He says, sense-making is just the way in which living beings make sense. The world has to mean something to them. They have to understand it to be a certain way. Another way he says it is, living beings enact or bring forth significance in their intimate engagements with their environments. Francisco Varela, his teachers, said this about sense-making. Order is order relative to somebody or some being who takes such a stance towards it. In the world of the living, order is indeed inseparable from the ways in which living beings make sense, so that they can be said to have a world. So this is about how do we understand what the world is? We know that the way we construct and perceive the world isn't the way that an ant or a bee or a whale does. So this idea that what's out there is equivalent to what we see is just not the case. We're making it somehow. We're participating in creating the world that we live in. But we experience it as reality until you start to mess with it. So I'll give you an example. This is Evan Thompson talking about bacteria and their world. So he says the cells tumble about until they hit upon an orientation that increases their exposure to sugar. Sugar is what's important for these bacteria. It's like food or energy. At which point they swim forward, up gradient, toward the zone of greatest sugar concentration. Sugar is significant to these organisms, and more of it is better than less because of the way their metabolism chemically realizes their autonomous organization. The significance and valence of sugar are not intrinsic to the sugar molecules, they're relational features tied to the bacteria as autonomous unities. Sugar has significance as food, but only in the milieu that the organism itself enacts through its autonomous dynamics. So the idea is basically that sense-making links together things like understanding, significance, motivation, emotional appraisal and response, and inferences about what's going to happen next. And so on this view, embodiment, cognition, feeling, and movement all come together in every moment of perception. So in every instance of perception, you're going to see these things deeply connected. And that's actually what perception is. So sense-making is this kind of general or multi-species phenomenology. And what I'm saying with the side view is that we're investigating those practices that fold back on that first layer of sense-making. So you have this like organismic level that's bringing the world forward to you in consciousness. And then there are these practices we've learned and discovered through history that you can actually use to change how that sense-making works. Okay, so what does this have to do with like human phenomenology? If this is like generally true of all organisms, there has to be something significant about human phenomenology. So I want to give you one definition of phenomenology that really drives home at the way that we can change these sense-making practices. So Dan Zahavi describes phenomenology this way. It says, phenomenology pays attention to the givenness of the object, but it does not simply focus on the object exactly as it is given. It also focuses on the subjective side of consciousness, thereby illuminating our subjective accomplishments and the intentionality that is at play in order for the object to appear as it does. When we investigate appearing objects, we also disclose ourselves as datives of manifestation, as those to whom objects appear. Okay, so there's some technical terms in there that are worth dwelling on for a sec. And the main one there is intentionality. And so when phenomenologists talk about intentionality, they don't mean it in the sort of common sense way of doing something on purpose. They mean that consciousness has this general quality of being about things. It's directed towards things. And these ordinary episodes of lived experience are actually always directed at an object, an event, a thought, a feeling, a thing. And the way that they show up is what phenomenologists mean by givenness. So when something is given to you, it's the givenness of the object. It showed up in this way for you. That's how it was given to your consciousness. And so there's a relationship here between how the object is given and the intentional act that produces it, right? And so there's a sense here that the skills of intentionality that one possesses they're kind of like efforts made in perception that give phenomena to experience in different ways. So perception on this view is kind of an active participation with events more than passive reception of them. So for Zahavi, experiences of understanding a phenomena to be a certain way, to mean what it does to the individual having the experience, vary in accordance with the skills of perception the individual brings to the encounter. Zahavi says, the same object can be given in a variety of modes. That's obvious. We know that. We know that we don't see the objects and people and events and things in the world in the same way. We encounter them differently. We talk to each other about them differently. We don't give the same stories about what happened ever. And that's because it's being given to us in different ways. And the way it's being given is related to our intentional skills, the way it's rendered to us. So the phenomenologist seizes on this dynamic by investigating the gap between that intentional representation as it's given to consciousness and what the phenomenon might be by itself. And the insight is that a lot of times what we think are differences in an object are actually differences in the subjects who are viewing it. And that's what accounts for that variability. So this move of kind of, I mentioned earlier that there's this askesis of a self kind of taking a distance from itself in order to become aware of itself, develop a relation to itself that it can modify in some way, is also kind of true of all of our experience in general. So phenomenologists talk about something called an epoche. And this is a word that most phenomenologists get from Edmund Husserl. And there's a variety of definitions. Zahavi says epoche is an abrupt suspension of a naive metaphysical attitude. Evan Thompson says it's a flexible and trainable mental skill of being able to suspend one's inattentive immersion in experience and to turn one's attention to the manner in which something appears or is given to experience. John Cogan calls it the name for whatever method we use to free ourselves from the captivity of the unquestioned acceptance of the everyday world. So I think without being able to perform something like an epoche, you're stuck in this kind of naive realism. The world really is the way you think it is, and everybody else is either wrong or deluded. And so it's this kind of taken for granted state of affairs that really limits your freedom to engage with yourself, with other people, and the world. But there's a way you could think of the epoche as just this kind of critical maneuver. Okay, I'm stopping myself from engaging the world in this way, and I'm accepting that this might be coming from me and not what's actually going on outside of me. That's a kind of a critical, kind of a negative move. But if you want to sort of start to work with your sense-making capacity, like that's the first move. And then the second move is sort of, what do you want it to be? What could it be? This is how things are showing up for you now, but how would you want them to show up? So this is where intentionality becomes something like skilled intentionality. So you're doing something on purpose. And so if the world as it's given to us is related to these sense-making capacities, then what I'm saying about the architect, the meditator, the carpenter, is that each one has learned to perceive the world in a certain way. They get it to show up in a meaningful way that's related not only to this basic mode of intentionality, but to these kind of skilled modes of intentionality that they have. They understand space. They understand the textures and contours of wood. They understand something about how to observe the breath in their inner states as they're passing by. These are all kinds of skilled intentionality. So the last piece of my little puzzle is breaking these sort of practice regimes out into larger spaces, larger environments. And so if I started with Hado and askesis and philosophy as spiritual practice or spiritual exercise, moved into this kind of phenomenological account of how intentionality and givenness works, the last piece here is, where are the spaces that allow these things to happen? If Hado is right and philosophy is something like a contemplative athletics, it's something like physical training, or it's related to these things that you would do in like a gymnasium, then it stands to reason that all of these other skills have practice environments that promote this kind of understanding. And so in this context, I think about James Gibson. James Gibson, the ecological psychologist, is famous for this idea of affordances. Affordances are basically this idea that as objects are being given to us through our acts of intentionality, to use that phenomenological language, we're not just seeing objects with physical properties, but we're seeing objects that are going to allow us to do things, or they're going to inhibit us from doing things, and we're trying to relate to them and find spaces that will allow us to accomplish our goals. And so there are a lot of basic examples, like a wall affords climbing, a roof affords shelter, built environments, gymnasiums afford training and fitness. A town square kind of facilitates meeting. That's like kind of the purpose of it. It's like a space where meeting can happen. A library affords reading. It's designed in such a way with the lighting and the sound and everything. It like lets you engage in these activities. So design, then, I'm saying, if it's done right, is about creating affordance environments that let us amplify or train up certain abilities in perception. It's about creating media ecologies that shape us in the direction of better practices. And media ecology is just this idea that every environment that we build folds back and starts to train us to behave in certain ways. It shapes us. Just like a natural ecology shapes the organisms that live there, our media ecologies shape how we participate in the built environments that we have around us. So one example that really kind of drove this home for me in terms of philosophy comes from Peter Sloterdijk. And he made this observation that, so there's this move called an epoche. And it's something you can do. You can do it right now. Like, you can get better at doing it. And when you get really drawn into something, you can initiate this kind of move. And it will do something for you. It will free you up in the moment in ways that you wouldn't have accessible to you if you couldn't do it. But Sloterdijk is saying, like, well, wait a minute, that's all well and good, but there's spaces where that's much harder to do. You get drawn into any number of scenarios where you actually have to struggle to achieve that. And I would argue that a lot of our built environments, our shopping centers, our consumer centers and things like that, they're actually like leveraging a fair amount of human psychology and neuroscience and behavioral psychology to get us to forget that we can do this kind of thing. They're trying to plug us in and immerse us into things that we shouldn't really be caring so much about. And so Sloterdijk is saying, like, what is a school? And he's really curious about Plato's academy. Like, why did we start building these philosophical schools? And he had this insight that it's an architectural epoche. A monastery, a retreat center, this school, any number of these places, they're trying to do some of the work for you. Or they're at least trying to set you up so that you'll succeed, right? It's like the opposite of a shopping mall. So Sloterdijk says this about Plato's academy. Plato is concerned to provide appropriate accommodation for persons in the precarious state of complete devotion to their thoughts. The original academy was dedicated to nothing other than innovation in spatial creation. The academy is the architectural equivalent of what Husserl apostrophized as epoche, a building for shutting out the world and bracketing in concern, an asylum for the mysterious guests that we call ideas and theorems. In today's parlance, we would call it a retreat or a hideaway. So this academy, Plato's academy, it's a kind of affordance space, right? And it's designed on purpose to make this thing called philosophy possible, at least in the beginning, right? There's a lot in what Socrates says, for example. There's a lot in what Hadot says about Socrates, about the importance about going back into the community and immersing yourself in the community. But there's at least a space where you can go and practice and train that will maybe build you up to be able to do some of those things. But Sloterdijk thinks something else is happening here. And so he says, in the same spirit, Sloterdijk appeals to a spiritual form of spatial planning and to a cessation from the, quote, trivial continuum of other spaces in the social order. Among the spaces of spiritual planning, we could list hermitages, monasteries, libraries, concert halls, groves, cemeteries, and cathedrals. These environments are immersive technologies for the installation of higher, often cosmic visions in the eyes of the practicing. While immersive, they also make a cut or a break with the daily world, offering reprieve and cessation for the practitioner. Here's what Sloterdijk writes about it. Cessation, writes Sloterdijk, produces real spaces. It sets up borders behind which a genuinely different mode of being dictates its will. Wherever cessationists dwell, the rules of an actually existing surrealism apply. So I think that's kind of cool. So askesis, philosophy as a kind of existential choice, a training, a contemplative athletics, a transformation in perception, sense-making, phenomenology, intentionality, givenness, all of these things, the media ecology, the affordance space, they're all kind of baked into what I think the side view is. And some of you have asked where the name comes from, and I'll tell you right now. This is a quote from Peter Sloterdijk. He wrote his little book on the history of philosophy, and he gives you his method in the beginning of that book. He says, people have been reading the history of philosophy as a sequence of completed texts and an analysis of those texts, and they give it in chronological order. Wouldn't it be better if we did something different? So here's what he says. Just as the history of science usually presumes that the scientists who do their disciplines already exist, the history of art has assumed since time immemorial that artists are the natural protagonists of the business that produces works of art, and that these players have always existed as well. What would happen if we rotated the conceptual stage 90 degrees in both cases? What would happen if we observed artists in their efforts to become artists in the first place? We could then see every phenomenon on this field more or less from a side view. And alongside the familiar history of art as a history of completed works, we could obtain a history of the training that made it possible to do art and the asceticism that shaped the artists. So I stole the name from him. I changed the article, so it's my creation now. He said a side view. I'm just saying there's one side view. Mine. So, I mean, that's the philosophy that I sort of baked into this cake and then tried to make disappear as much as I could. So that's where the name comes from. I mentioned already that the first couple podcasts are up. the first essays are up. I want to hear from you guys about how this feels, how you think about it. I also want you guys to participate in this, either just by reading and listening along or coming up with your own ideas, your own contributions. There's a submission form on the website. You can talk to me directly. A lot of us know each other. So yeah, the articles and podcasts are up. There's going to be an e-journal and a print journal of those first 10 essays probably in November. And then I've already printed a few hard copy prototypes of books. And so starting early next year, I'm hoping to add like a publishing vein to the whole project. But from now on, the articles and podcasts will be coming out on a rolling basis. So there won't be like a fixed schedule or, you know, all 10 articles of the second issue will come out at once. They're just going to come up on the website as they're ready. So if you want to visit the website, it's online. It's thesideview.co. And on all of the social media, it's at thesideview.co. Thanks.
Just hearing at the end how speaking to the philosophy that you baked into this cake and then making it disappear, I so appreciate, speaking of intentionality, all the intention that has been put into this, yeah, and how long you've been with it. Yeah. And throughout you speaking, I just couldn't help but wonder, with this emphasis on philosophy as a way of life and practice, how has this shaped your own life? And you know, in the months that you've been working on this and sitting with it years, but even before the side view was conceived, how, if this isn't too personal to ask, how has that shaped you?
Somebody stole one thing I learned. When I searched the domains, like, is this domain available? There's like a kind of like a bot that crawls the web to see who's searching what domains. And when I came back an hour later, it had bought it. So that's why it's .co and not .com. But it's kind of cut off because of the projector, but you can see the homepage. Yeah, a lot of this had to do with trying to figure out like how to coordinate all of these parallels I saw in, you know, having sort of an interest in like meditation and contemplative practice, an interest in philosophy, and like really just sort of like rational discursive reasoning, and then like martial arts and psychedelics, and like seeing that for me these things are all really related. But is there a way that you can talk about how they're related without it just being like my cabinet of curiosities, you know, like, so a lot of it started with trying to, you know, just get some more integration in my own life, and then realizing that this doesn't even have just to do with philosophy or spiritual practice. It has to do with all of these other things that I don't really know about. And now I want to know how does this work for all these other people, you know, like one of the first podcasts I did is with a friend of mine. He's a sound engineer. He writes music, really good sort of textured ambient soundscapes, but he also does digital forensics. And so he has this ear where he basically takes like the whatever cameras and camera phones and microphones and CCTVs that may have caught part of a crime, and he tries to piece together what happened. And I brought him over to my apartment when I was setting up the recording studio to do some of the podcasts. And the first thing he did was start to identify everything that was like ambient in the room, stuff that I never paid attention to. And so for him, all of that stuff is like right there. And I know that that's true of me. There's stuff that I see like right away and other people just don't. And I'm kind of like, how do you not see that? And so there's something there about that process of training and experience and learning. So I mean, it kind of started there. Like, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's definitely where it came from.
I'm so curious about that personal piece.
Yeah, yeah, it's about mental sanity. getting all these pieces to come together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's great to see all the different pieces of this puzzle presented at once, because we've been kind of, I think I can speak for a lot of your friends of being excited to hear the different sort of facets as you're presenting them piecemeal, but now to see the gestalt is really powerful. So you're kind of posing for me some questions that have been urgent for a while, and you're helping to clarify them, so that's progress. And so I want to say it like this. To your neo-occultism, I want to propose a neo-traditionalism, which is concerned with the revelation of the good. Let me put it like this. So, like, in the organism's sort of comportment towards its environment, you've occasionally talked about some attainment of value or good, but it's not clear what the criterion is for that. And it's not clear, like, how you adjudicate different forms of risk.
Yeah.
Or how you control various possibilities for self-betrayal.
Right.
So, for example, you seem to equivocate between the person who decides, or the agent who decides to undertake a practice, and the agent created by that practice.
Right.
In some important sense, the resultant agent is not a decision made by the prior one. There's a kind of slippage here. Mm-hmm. So you can't say that the initial agent attained a higher value.
Right.
And so I can't see the good emerging in this. I feel like the good needs to be revealed.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why I'm saying, to your neo-occultism, to your, you know exactly what I mean by that.
Yeah.
I propose a neo-traditionalism, which is a revelatory sort of, I don't know, is it a telos? Not necessarily.
Yeah.
But some source of the good, in principle, external to any of these forms of freedom.
Yeah. So it can't, and I think this is a problem that it's a problem for, well, I mean, what is the good is one of the biggest problems in philosophy and in human society. But it's like in that kind of gap between like epistemology and metaphysics, say, it's like something that plagues phenomenology and various kinds of idealism. Like how is this not just a function of my intentionality? Like there has to be something beyond like this sort of relative shifting spectrum of intentional objects. So I see what you're asking as related to that question about what is the good and how to align with it. I think you have to place yourself in doubt, and you have to not assume that you are the good person, I think. And I pulled up, this is Sam Mickey. Many of you know Sam Mickey. He's a PCC alumnus. This is his essay, Practice is Not a Life Hack. And one of the things that when I was pitching this idea to various people, one of the things that people kept saying was like, oh, like this is the kind of thing like where if you got good at it, like you could get really efficient at things. And I was at, like, and this kind of like, mindfulness will make you more productive at work because it'll keep your cortisol levels down and you'll be able to work a longer shift. Like that's not really what we're going for, And so Sam wrote this essay that I just felt like was just perfect for it, because he was kind of saying that if you're engaged in these kinds of practices, if you're looking at your own sort of sense-making apparatus, it's not going to make life easier for you. It's going to make it more complex. It's going to make it richer. It's going to maybe sort of increase your sense of agency and accountability, but it's not going to make it easier or more accountable. And I see this as related to what you're saying too, is that there's something else that's like drawing this forward. Like you want to change because, sure, maybe you want to get better at whatever your skill is so that you can make more money, but you want to change because you want to suffer less, and you want to change because you want to stop causing suffering in other people, or at least as much as you are right now. And I think these kinds of practices, they're not a guarantee for that. They could actually be a way of, teaching you how to increase other people's suffering by learning how to mess with them in ways that they don't even understand. But, the good has to be baked in there. But what is it? I don't know. It's a sense.
It has to be a commitment.
It's a commitment to something, yeah.
question.
Yeah.
So, my question is around like mediums for communication, especially communicating ideas or events, news, and like your perspective of how just like an architectural space, a particular form of communication medium might have an ideology baked into it that assumes knowledge as something that is just this absolute givenness, and what alternatives might be out there. Just any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is really important about, going in the direction of media ecology or the affordance space or just the material conditions is another thing that for whatever reason my personality draws in that direction as an explanation. I'm almost a kind of a Marxist in how I explain the behavior of things as kind of rooted in these material economic structures. But that's also like a really limited and limiting kind of perspective. So just the idea of like a media ecology, that there's some kind of circulation happening, is more appealing to me. But I think you're right that the phones that we have and the technology that we use, especially the communications technology, expresses a certain kind of economic ideology and a psychological ideology. It's not designed to increase your happiness and reduce your suffering. It's designed to get you to interact with your phone more often. And there's why? Because the longer you're on the platform, the more ads they can show you and the more revenue the company makes. And so the whole thing is just designed around making money. So I don't know, just being aware of that might help you design something different.
It's really great. Thanks for creating this. It's a gift. It's awesome to see it launched. When I had so many thoughts while you were talking. I won't try to communicate all of them, but I want to throw out just two. One is going to piggyback Aaron's comment a little bit. But the first one, before I get to that, is this amazing, and I think really powerful notion of that Sloterdijk and you have brought out about what was it? He doesn't call it the practical epoche. He calls it
the architectural.
The architectural epoche. Yeah. It made me think of already in the early 1980s, the Czech phenomenologist Erezin Kohak, an environmental thinker, was talking about a practical epoche when he was retreating to his sort of 1980s version of Walden off the grid. And I remember when I first read that, it made me think about how, in a sense, we've been doing these epoches practically all the time.
Right.
That's what traditional community life is built around.
Right.
There are places you go to get married. There are places you go to think. And in one sense, in one sense, the sort of the radicalness of what you're calling us back to is really only radical because we've suffered through the brutality of modernist functional architecture.
It's true.
The notion of the reduplicability of our various sites that can be used for whatever it is they happen to be put towards, as opposed to being built, as opposed to certain spaces and also times being cultivated for given ends. And that was just one of the. I was struck by in your discussion of these things, and I get the kind of Marxist built environment and material culture bit, but I wanted to suggest that also there's times that we structure to create that kind of an epoche. We build that culturally,
like a town.
What was that?
Like a whole town, what's a town center?
Yeah, but also Sunday. Or Rosh Hashanah
Totally.
or
Yeah.
solstice.
Midnight.
Midnight. Yes, yeah, the watch
Yeah.
of the night. I mean, to
Yeah.
take a, one that we've mostly lost, but that
Right.
people used to get up and do really great things during.
Oh, yeah, that's fun.
So, anyway.
Yeah, that's a really great. It's definitely underemphasized in what I'm saying. It's fun to think about, but it's obviously huge.
And then the other bit was just thinking about this notion of the good. It struck me that one way to think about the good without defining the good too fully at the outset in a way that would exclude lots of communities that may want to participate or not, because then we each have our own little good defined. There's a sense in which what I heard you emphasizing was the sort of intentionality of the agent who engages in practice.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know that you recognize that the agent doesn't give herself to be at the outset, that there's
Right.
a kind of, there's a sort of priority of being or of
Mhm.
actuality before I can ever start making decisions.
Right.
Like I didn't build this.
Yeah.
And that could be one of the places where a relationship with the good is discerned, right?
Right.
In sort of returning to the original gift, not just the givenness
Right.
that reveals my relationship, but the giftedness that reveals my like the ecstasy of my existence that
Right.
it's always given to me from outside of me.
Yeah. Well, so there's like the one kind of move I was talking about was the epoche, but various states of ecstasy, like ecstasis,
Yeah.
like the peak experience, is the same kind of thing in a different way, maybe in like a kind of a more like fireworks exploding kind of way, but it has the same function, I think, of like jolting you out of the assumed immediacy of the world.
Well, and there's a way too, isn't there, of returning to just like the ecstasy of my own being. That's
Yeah.
might not be fireworks all the time,
Right.
but is like literally I stand outside of myself in relationship
Yeah.
to my past, in relationship to my birth, my
Sure.
mortality, and my death.
Right.
And so
The thing that I guard against when you start to talk in this way is related to this question of who is the agent, where does the agent show up in the causal stream, and how much agency does the agent actually have, even given all of this.
right.
And that's, plug Aaron's podcast. I recorded a podcast with Aaron. We spent some time talking about that the self that you think you are is sort of showing up sort of downstream of a lot of causal events. And not just like, stuff happened before you were born, but in each moment of your waking experience, all of those moments are like this, rising surface of
Yeah.
a whole bunch of causes and effects that you're not aware of. And I'm sort of skeptical that you can like really get some like absolute distance or sovereignty and just like take your ship wherever you want it to go. I think it's more like there's this really powerful stream coming behind you, and you have like some rudders that can move. But you can do some cool stuff while you're flowing.
It strikes me that a relationship to that stream though is part of what we might mean by the good.
Right.
That, I'm not entirely convinced of that as I say it, but
So I just want to say that I think what you said is beautiful, but I don't think it's what Adam said. I was trying to say that he was equivocating by saying, in order to attain reflexivity, you first have to establish yourself
right.
as existing. And that is strictly false.
Right.
And so
But I don't think
there's an equivocation there that I think we need to get really precise about in order to get clear on the relationship between our becoming, and the attainment of value. Do you accept that?
I just also don't think that from conversations with Adam, I'm like bringing in from things that were off the reading list now. But
Yeah.
I don't think that's what Adam
I just want to thematize that appeal to a kind of primordial sort of faith, let's call it. in that sort of gift. First, you're less given.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, we can talk about it.
Well, kind of, but very, very tangentially related. Is this my question of what is the intentionality of a phenomenon? Because we're talking a lot about the intentionality and the givenness that we bump up against when we engage with something, but there's a potential, right, for a phenomenon to have its own gifts that it's offering up to us.
Yeah.
And the way that I think about that in sort of practical terms in relation to what you said is twofold. The first one was thinking about sensory organs specifically and how they may or may not adapt to these sorts of changes, right? Like how does your eye change when finally you can see things differently? Right. So then how does that contribute to evolution? Like what if evolution, rather than being fueled by fitness, is fueled by philosophy, right? Like there's a whole world in which you could kind of open up to that. But then also it makes me think, especially in terms of media ecology, of natural landscape. And so again, thinking in terms of the way we look at evolution as a biological response to a natural environment, but maybe there's another way that we can kind of look at that as more inherent within an interactive condition that doesn't have to do with whether or not you can eat or climb to the highest tree. But it's like a natural connection or something like that.
Well,
so there's all of that.
Yeah, there's some sense that I think you can argue that like media ecology, like as a sort of field, is mostly focused on humans. Right. But I think all organisms are little media ecologists. They're little builders. So there's a lot of people who are doing interesting things on like niche construction and how building niches like creates this feedback loop. So like it's not just like organisms trying to adapt to a fixed world. We're all kind of creatively engaging and interpreting and remaking it in ways that suit us. You know, so
we all meaning beyond the human.
Yeah. We organisms.
We organisms.
Yeah. We living beings. Yeah.
But what do you think about specifically humans in a natural landscape rather than humans in architecture landscape?
I mean, I think this came up, I gave a talk in this room about sort of media ecology and philosophy, where it was just sort of just this talk, but just that media ecology piece kind of extended.
You talked about the spiders.
Yeah, the spiders doing that. But yeah, the natural landscape is like the first sort of potential for like a cave or like some sort of sacred or ritual site. Like it's usually pretty evident when you look at places like that like it's a clearing, like it's on a cliff's edge, it's protected on almost every side. Like there's something special about the place that makes it suited for that. It's a natural affordance environment instead of a built one. And I think what we do is just take some of those properties and characteristics and sort of make artificial versions of them, you know. But the natural landscape is the first one.
Thanks.
Everyone else has another question. I've got tons.
Try not to talk.
Just thinking about that, as you know, one of the first great philosophical metaphors for this, and maybe the most influential philosophical metaphor for this, was Plato's allegory of the cave.
Right.
But what's intriguing about that is Plato's sort of taken and reversed the situation as you've described it, and that as we usually experience it, right? So usually we experience it like we're immersed in the world, and then we go into a special place, Area 5, 1453, a temple, whatever, and we go there and then do special things, and then we go back out to the world.
Yeah.
Whereas Plato's reversed it, and he says, actually, no, you're in this special confined area,
right?
The cave, and then someone forcibly drags you, kicking and screaming, up into the natural environment,
right?
The wide open space, and then you go back into the cave.
So there's like a dialectic there, but there's also like affordances. The word affordance has this like positive valence to it, and it means like it affords something, but there's like negative affordances. There's like affordances that, like I was saying, like stop certain kinds of, or they at least like severely discourage them. You know, it's like playing the game on hard. Like if you want to do it in this zone, then this is going to take a little more work. You know, so yeah, the cave is an interesting thought because it's almost like it keeps the real world hidden from you, in a way. But I think the dynamic is still the same. It's still messing with perception in the same way.
Yeah, when Husserl describes the applique, he talks about bracketing the natural attitude in order to be returned to this sort of flux of life, basically. So it has both of those qualities to it.
Yeah.
It's both entering into something artificial, but only in one sense because we so regularly dwell within things that are constructed. That we lose track of the fact that they're constructed.
Right.
So aside from goodness, we can talk about mastery. And I feel like mastery is not straightforwardly an achievement. I don't know if I'm going to be able to say it very well.
I think a lot of what the side view does, and its kind of center of gravity, is in this like middle slice of ordinary experiences, and then like there's non-ordinary states that this might not just paper over so well, but I think that middle slice needs to be grappled with somehow.
Very generative.
I can throw something in. I had a hard time following you just because I was doing all this.
Thanks for doing that, by the way.
Yeah, for sure. And I haven't delved into the project and everything. I read the flyer and I was like, wow, this is really awesome. So I was really digging what you wrote there. And then I just had a hard time. Following the whole thing. But
the CIS flyer, like the one Ashton.
Yeah. Okay. But where I can tap in is like with Jake's mention of the allegory in the cave. Like, I'm curious what you think about the archetypal realm, because like the way I see Plato's cave is like we live in a world where we don't actually see the true nature of reality because we're not seeing the archetypal core, and that's the actual truth or the good in my perspective. And just how does that fit, or does it fit? Like, because it seems as though recognizing the archetypal perspective and then specifically how it's connected to the whole cosmos is actually, but then bringing that back to the cave and then being able to see more of the truth as it is revealed within, not as it's constructed from without. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think, I mean, on one level, I think it plugs right in. I don't have too many smart things to say about how, like, the reality or not of Platonic archetypes, but like the way it connects or would connect is like, I mean, you could think of somebody like Carl Jung, who's working with archetypes in a different sense, and that kind of cultivated sense of seeing like complexes and archetypal constellations like that is, you know, sort of exactly the kind of training that I'm interested in exploring, and like that's something that's present for people who are versed in that kind of material and that kind of understanding of why people do the things that they do. They can sort of see it, and you can do that with other types of clinical psychology. You know, there's a perceptual ability, like just in the therapeutic process and the diagnostic process, that sees things like complexes that aren't like physical, and so in that sense, you could talk about archetypes in that way as something you have to cultivate an ability to perceive. And if you can't, then that whole sort of layer isn't going to be part of how you respond to things.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly what I was really resonating with in the kind of
archetypal I.
Yeah, that how we construct that perception and then ultimately how it's negotiated amongst the collective.
Right.
Anybody else?
I am curious about the project. Just something practical. I'm thinking that there are a lot of layers and a lot of things that you're covering with this big puzzle, like you said. And I'm just curious if you're foreseeing ways of expanding that you're not right now kind of holding, because you said that there's the editing part that you are already envisioning. But just curious if you already kind of envision other ways that you would like it to expand, or maybe they're already kind of coming through the network and the connections with different people.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing to do is not to stick to too rigid or too narrow of a conception of what it is and what it's going to be. When I first kind of started just throwing out little nets to see if anybody would be interested in participate, there's Sam and Aaron and Matt are involved, but the other 15 people are people I've never met. And I was astounded to see that there were people who there's kind of 3 easy sections in my little presentation, and they ended up, even though that wasn't all sort of spelled out in what I was advertising with this, the essays I have slot into those 3 sections. And so there was something that clicked for people about it. So I don't know. I imagine that what happens if it's allowed to continue to grow is that the first response is to what I put out there, and now people can, if they want, respond to what these people put out there. And so now it's kind of it's not mine, So I don't know where it goes. I'll just help it along.
I like that, just sort of spinning it and then watching it go and see what orbits around it. But I was thinking about what everyone was saying in terms of revelation. And I was thinking about your friend who came, the first person that you did for the podcast who came to your house and who's the sound engineer and the forensics. First, that's the coolest job I could ever imagine. Also a little traumatizing, but kind of cool. But I would imagine that you now, presumably, hear those sounds in a way that you didn't hear them before. Once he kind of was able to touch a sort of awareness to you about all of this ambiance. And so, as much as practice is a part of philosophy, to what extent is just sort of instantaneous revelation also a part? And does one happen without the other? Is revelation only a result of practice? And can you get further without the revelation part? Or, I don't know.
I think this is there are so many configurations of how that can come together.
Maybe for you personally, I'm wondering.
Oh, well, I don't know, but I've had this experience so many times, and we have this just osmosis with one another, just naturally. And I can maybe, if I remind myself to do it, hear what he was pointing out in my apartment. Yeah. But I can't do what he does just walking down the street. Okay. I have to, that's where the exercise comes in. I'd actually have to go and do that every day. I'd have to get my reps in if I wanted that to be possible. Right. But he did let me know that I'm missing a lot of stuff in my sort of auditory spectrum. And that's just oh, yeah, okay. Obviously, I mean, I know that conceptually, but to have that pointed out. But that happens a lot. I've done things in combat sports, in kickboxing, training next to a high-level amateur competitor, or I've trained a couple of times with just next to high-level pro fighters, and I've never moved like that in my life, And it's just okay, this guy's here, I'm not moving like him, but I'm moving better than I did when he wasn't there. And it's just because you see little things, like just little tiny adjustments that you weren't conscious of, and it changes that. And you can think of any example that's like that, you know. But then again, it's like it's just talking to that person, being next to them, it's not going to stay, you know.
Yeah, like I'm thinking about, like I was saying about your game analogy, and you still have to kind of level up in the level, right? But then you still have to practice that level and die 1,000 times before you actually can pass it.
Yeah. Well, so there's those kinds of things that seem to track across whatever you're trying. Like failure is a big one. Just like fail fast and often, and just keep going. So there's some general rules. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank
you.
you.
Go check out the actual website.